For my presentation, I'm going to be talking about providing students with effective feedback. I'd like to start by getting a variety of experts' opinions and viewpoints on what exactly is feedback. Fred Meiser talks about feedback is helping our students assess their performance, identify areas where they're right on target, and then provide them tips on ways they can improve. Grant Wiggins talks about feedback is value neutral. It describes what a student did and what they did not do. Robin Jackson talks about three particular areas of feedback: letting students know where they are in relation to the objectives and what they need to do to get there, providing it opportunities to learn and grow, and helping students get better at learning, which is the ultimate goal of school. I like this particular definition of feedback because it talks about the integral part of the instructional dialogue between teachers and students, and then moving on to students and students, and then students and themselves. So I think that's an important component of the power of feedback, is that it is an instructional dialogue happening on a frequent basis. Doug Reeves talks about feedback not only tells how they performed, but it tells them how they can improve the next time. And that's an important component of feedback, is providing that opportunity to improve upon a task or skill the next time. This particular quote by Jan Chappas talks about the effective feedback occurs during the learning while there's still time to act upon it. Effective feedback doesn't come at the end of a summative assessment or at the end of a quarter. There needs to be opportunities for students to act upon their learning, act upon the feedback, because the ultimate goal is that they're improving and growing and learning. So what does the research say about providing students feedback? Bellin and Blank talk about how when feedback is used correctly, that students can attain the same level of achievement as the top 20% of students. Because when we give feedback that is so focused on what a student is doing and what they need to increase or change so they can work toward that learning objective, it helps narrow that gap. Robert Marzano talks about, in this quote, how John Hattie analyzed almost 8,000 studies, and he found that when you're giving those dollops of feedback, as he describes, or those very timely, short feedbacks along the way, that's the way that we're going to improve education and enhance achievement. So when you look at the characteristics of feedback, there are 5 main characteristics that jump out. The first one is that it needs to be timely. It needs to happen right when the learning is occurring. At times that can be difficult to give students feedback right on the spot, but if you can't provide that opportunity to give feedback exactly when it's occurring, the sooner the better. There are a couple studies here that are linked that talk about when the feedback is immediate versus delayed, you see a greater increase in the performance. When students know what they're doing well and what they can do better or different to improve their learning, and when that feedback is given right at the moment, they're going to do better. When it happens weeks later or at the end of the quarter, it's hard for students to internalize that. So the feedback needs to be timely. The second characteristic is that the feedback needs to be specific. That language has to be so specific and precise that students know exactly what they're doing well. When you say a great job, that doesn't mean anything to a student. Great job on what? What am I doing well? What do I need to do different? Or when you say you're not quite there yet, that doesn't provide that information of what they did wrong or what they can do differently next time to improve. So when you're giving your feedback, when you can be specific to a learning target or a learning goal, and it's based on those personal observations, it's going to help the learner achieve at a higher level. The third characteristic of feedback is that it needs to be constructive or corrective. What are they doing well? What are areas that they need to improve upon? We need to choose the feedback that relates to those major learning goals and the essential elements of the assignment. If the focus is on the content of a writing piece, then maybe the feedback shouldn't be on the spelling and grammar and punctuation, which is important, but what is the main focus of that? If the focus is on the content, let's provide the feedback on the content. The fourth characteristic of feedback is that it needs to be focused on the product or the behavior, not on the student. When you can explain the purpose of your monitoring, your feedback, and ensure that learners understand how the feedback is meant to help them, that's where the value lies in providing that feedback. And the last characteristic of feedback is it verified or understood? Do our students know what the feedback means? Do they know how to apply that feedback and take that feedback to improve and change so that the learning can grow over time? And how are we going to follow up with the students? How as an educator, what are we going to do to make sure that that feedback we provided is applied in the learning? So those are 5 main characteristics of feedback that help the student grow and develop. It needs to be timely, it needs to be specific, it needs to be constructive or corrective, it needs to focus on the behavior, not the student, and we need to make sure that the student understands what the feedback is. So when you look at the essential elements of feedback, there are 3 according to Black and William that stand out. The first one is the recognition of the desired goal. We need to understand, make sure the student knows what the desired goal is. There needs to be evidence of where they currently are in that process of learning. And then the third element is we need to close the gap between the desired goal and where they currently are. And that's where that feedback element is so powerful. So when we look at the recognition of the desired goal, there's a lot of clarity that you'll see here. Clarity of the learning goal, of the content area, of the indicators and objectives. We need to provide that vision of excellence so our students know this is what is expected each and every time. There are methods you can do to ensure that students understand these learning goals. You can have them develop I can statements. By the end of this lesson or this unit, I can or I will be able to. You can provide exemplar text, samples. Students need to see what is expected. And it's one thing to hear about it, but when they can actually see an example, that's very powerful. The tricky part with that one is you don't want to provide too many exemplars because then students think that that's the only way they can approach a lesson or an objective, and you start to get more cookie cutter and less creative ideas. Helping students identify successful criteria is a powerful part of the process, and having them work until they succeed, providing multiple opportunities to be successful. One and done just doesn't cut it, and it shouldn't. We need to provide students the opportunity to go through that cycle where they demonstrate their learning, we provide feedback, they go back, they readjust their learning, we provide more feedback until they succeed. When you're looking at assessment in terms of feedback, if students can talk about and reflect on their own work using that language and those descriptors that we talked about in the elements, that's where that positive feedback or that powerful notion of feedback comes in. When students can use feedback and use the language that has been established, the two mesh together and you'll see higher levels of learning. Here's a infographic that describes assessment for learning. You'll notice it encompasses what we've been talking about. There are those clear learning goals. There's a success of criteria. What is this going to look like? We're going to provide that descriptive feedback. Peer and self-assessment is another component of that feedback. As a learner, what am I doing? Or as learning partners, how are we learning together and what can we do better? And then based on those first four, I'm going to create those individual learning goals. But you'll notice right in the heart of this infographic is that descriptive feedback. The second element is you need to be able to pinpoint with laser-like accuracy where students are currently performing. If we can tell students this is the end goal and look, this is where you are, it helps to clarify the next steps, which is closing that gap between the two. So how can you close the gap between the learning goal and where a current level of learning is? Let's provide guidance on how to improve. We can't assume that students know the strategies and tips. We need to help provide that and model those for students. Provide student-friendly versions of learning targets, those I can statements. Provide help and time to improve so they can apply the feedback and deepen their level of learning. When you're sharing feedback, it can be one-on-one, and that's typically the best because then you're focusing with that particular student on ways that that child can grow and learn. It needs to be descriptive but not evaluative. Focus on what they're doing well and what they can continue to improve on. Sometimes you can have group or class feedback when there are students who are missing the same concept, and this often allows for opportunities for reteaching in a different way. When you're providing feedback, there are things to consider as soon as possible. Give that immediate feedback. It helps clear up misconceptions, and it oftentimes gives students the opportunity to think right then and there what they're doing well. When the timing of the feedback comes weeks later, it's lost the impact. Or when you go over an assignment and there's no opportunity to show improvement, the power of feedback is diminished. When you're giving feedback, it depends on the student and on the case, the amount of feedback. You want to be able to walk that fine line of helping them understand what to do, but you don't want to give them too much support in that the assignment or the lesson is done for them. Think of it as those teachable moments, but keeping them succinct. So when you're thinking about the amount of feedback, 2 to 3 main points is a great opportunity. Commenting on as many strengths as weaknesses, keeping that balance. Another component of feedback is helping students learn to use feedback. And here are 4 strategies. You can model about giving feedback to yourself, teaching students how to self and peer assess, be clear about the learning target, and design lessons which allow students to use feedback on previous work. So when you're looking at the different levels of feedback, you can provide feedback on the task, the processing of the task, self-regulation, and the student as an individual. This last slide here demonstrates the feedback model according to Hattie and Timperley. You'll notice that there's a purpose, what teachers and students can do, and I love the part at the bottom, how it describes the 3 questions. There's feed up, what am I doing? Where am I going? Feed back, how am I going? And feed forward, where do I go next? Hopefully you'll see the benefit of providing timely, specific, corrective feedback to students to help them gain a better understanding of their learning.